I have devoted all of my adult life to this subject. I only debate with my equals. All others I teach. Shall we continue or what? I'm not clear now.
Go ahead, Dr. Clark.
You, Trees?
Go ahead, Dr. Clark.
Broadly speaking, honestly speaking, the book, Not Out of Africa, a good sophomore effort, is not really about not out of Africa. Last year it was the bell curve. This year it's not out of Africa. Next year it'll be something else. This is part of a world war against the role of African people in the history of the world. If we began mankind, how is it that the last branch of the human race to enter that arena, marked civilization, now think they brought civilization? Now, it is part of a war over and above Professor Lefkowitz's book and over and above her political naivete. Her naivete is about what is happening in the Western world. There was a recent book called The Tribes. It diagrammed every people, major people on the earth, searching for a piece of turf for themselves. It left out the African people because the other people, including Asian imperialists, have plans to take over Africa. There have been several articles in the New York Times advocating the recolonization of Africa. This book and other literature of this nature mean to prepare the world to accept a rationalization for the re-enslavement of Africa. Now, and when you deal with the black endorsers of the book, running dogs of the new imperialism, professional white behind kissers, and as Carlos Cook used to say, a disgrace to the skin they wear. These people, if I'm be so kind to call them that, are running from themselves and teaching us a lesson that we should have learned long ago. Sometimes white wannabes are more dangerous than whites. And sometimes they'll fight you harder to be accepted by whites. They are running from their own people and running from definition. Now, what we need to look at now is how Professor Lefkowitz neglected the white writers through history, the radical European writers who wrote positively of Africa and who identified the relationship of Africa to the ancient Greece. Now, if given time, and I probably won't be given it this evening, I can prove to you with your satisfaction, if you are listening, that Rome and Greece was not European creations. These were Mediterranean-inspired nations and couldn't be created by Europe because at the time there was no Europe.
Hello guys, welcome back to the channel. Thank God for this beautiful day that God has given unto us to reminisce, to look back to our Afrocentric scholars, to our African scholars that helped us understand some concepts of Africa, because most of us, we looked down upon ourselves. We didn't recognize the roles that we have played, and just the importance of just being black as a person, So reminds me, and it takes me back to a debate which was done in the year 1996, where Dr. John Henry Clark versus Mary Lefkowitz, they met to discuss which continent generally. The other person was trying to argue in an Afrocentric perspective. Mary Lefkowitz was trying to argue on a Eurocentric perspective. And just buckle up, this is an important debate that I want us to talk about. Remember, the 1996 debate between Dr. John Henry Clark and Mary Lefkowitz was a highly significant event in the African and African American studies, as it touched a deep historical and cultural issues related on the legacy of ancient Egypt, the roots of Western civilization, and the representation of Black history. Now, a little bit of a background just before us getting to understand what really happened in this debate, and you understand the role of Dr. John Henry Clark, what he has done to the Black community, and its pursuit of making us Africans to understand a number of things that happened in our continent, most probably things that the Western world never wanted us as Black people or Africans to know. Now, I just want to give you the background of debate because I believe that is important, and then I'll just let the video play. I want you to just hear how things went on during those times. So Dr. John Henry Clark was a respected historian and a scholar of African history. He was known for his Afrocentric views, emphasizing that the African origin of civilization, particularly the contributions of ancient Egypt to world history and its influence on Greece and Rome. On the outside, Mary Lefkowitz, a classical scholar from Wesley College, was known for her defense of a Eurocentric narrative of history, which traditionally minimizes the role of African in the development of Western civilization. I understand now you get to generally see the standing points or the talking points of these two scholars. Now, the debate was largely triggered by Lefkowitz' in 1996 book, Not Out of Africa, How Afrocentrism Became an Excuse to Teach Myth of History. In the book of Lefkowitz criticized the Afrocentric claims that ancient Egypt was primarily a Black African civilization. She argued that these claims were historically inaccurate and based on myths rather than fact. Lefkowitz's work was perceived by many in the Afrocentric community as a direct attack to the scholarship that sought to recenter Africa in the narrative of world history. I hope that now you get to see how things unraveled. And this is something which has been happening for the longest time, right? Because the narrative, and at this point, I'm so strong in the opinion of John Clark Henry, because just even if you try to look at back things which are happening today, it is always the Western world that is trying to erase a number of things that Africans did, or the potential of what Africans can do, or generally what we did, and the names and the history has become his history, right? So we have people like Dr. John Henry Clark, who is trying to hear out his opinions, and it makes it clear that he doesn't argue out with people that definitely are of not, his caliber or class or something in regards to these studies, because there's an African American who has done a lot of, African American studies, African studies relationship, and with him, this is something that he says that he has done for the longest time. Now, buckle up as we dive right into this video, and I hope that both of us are going to learn and greatly have major discourse out of this. If you're watching this video for the first time, I'll definitely ask you to subscribe to the channel, to join the membership, and really get to see what it can offer you. You can also check my Patreon on the other side. Until then, let's dive right into the video.
All right.
Thank you very much.
Will I take it?
I now ask Professor Lefkowitz to present her 5-minute conclusion.
Can you hear me? Well, let me just begin by saying what my book, Not Out of Africa, isn't about. It's not an attack on Afrocentrism. If Afrocentrism means recognition of African achievements in the world, it doesn't seek to deprive Africans of their rightful heritage. Africans do not need Greece to have a cultural heritage. They have a rich cultural heritage. Egypt is just one part of it. They don't need Greece. I'm concerned because what is being offered in some quarters as African history is really a European myth. And thus, instead of getting real information about Africa, what people are learning is something that's really 18th century French. It's Eurocentric, it's based on Greek and Roman myths. I do not myself think that one should do that, because Egypt itself is so fascinating, so rich. There is so much that you can learn and know, and that I myself, as a result of all this work that we have been doing for the last 4 years and more, have come to know and understand about Egypt. I would like to now spend a great deal of the rest of the time that I have learning about that, because it is so different. It's so different from what the Greeks thought that it was. Herodotus was very impressed by Egypt. He wanted to say that everything in Greece that he could think of came or had some connection with Egypt. He didn't really understand the depth and richness of Egypt, which went in directions way beyond what he knew from his own experience in Greece. So I am concerned about that in Not Out of Africa. I've tried to explain why the notion of an Egyptian mystery system, which is basically a French invention, it's based on a novel that everyone has forgotten about, but still you can find in some very obscure libraries, get it up in Boston even, and that book, which was by a French priest, is based on Greek and Roman sources and tries to describe a Greco-Roman Egypt, and that this myth was preserved in Freemasonry and thus came into American culture. So I'm concerned that that myth not be taught, the notion that there was an Egyptian mystery system. Instead, I'd like to see people learn, all people learn, not just black people, white people, any people learn about Africa and the civilizations therein. And Egypt is particularly appealing because it's so old, it's so impressive, its role in the Mediterranean was so vast, and so many other civilizations were touched by it. Even if only slightly, they did get touched by it, and we have to work on that.
People in a book that's supposed to be about all mankind, and what called my attention to the neglect of Africa was the Sunday school lessons with all those white angels. And when they said God is love, God is kind, God is no respect of kith or kin, I kept wondering, why didn't he let at least one or two little brown or black angels sneak into heaven? So I began to suggest that somebody else had tampered with God's book in favor of somebody else, and that the Bible to a great extent was a rationale for European domination, but had been used as such. Then, coming to, after leaving Georgia, after a white man that I've worked for, if he's alive today, he's a liberal with a capital L. His name was Gagsteiner. I asked him about some books on the African people in ancient history. And in the language of the South, he let me down slow. He spoke kindly. He said, John, I'm sorry that You came from a race that has made no history. But if you persevere, if you obey laws and study hard, you make history someday, and you personally might one day be a great Negro like Booker T. Washington. Booker T. Washington was the one thing whites approved of at that time. All right, while doing chores at a local high school, holding the coat and the books of a recitalist, I opened a book called The New Negro, and I found an essay by a Puerto Rican of African descent, Arthur Schomburg. The essay was called The Negro Digs Up His Past. Now I knew I was not only older than slavery, I was older than my oppressor. And my oppressor was the last branch of the human race to enter that arena. Mock civilization. Don't get mad, get smart, prove me wrong. Now, in the old Harlem History Club, under Willis and Huggins, long since dead, John Jackson, who died only a few years ago, and we had to take up a collection to bury him, Charles Seifert, J. Rogers, under all of these teachers pointing me to good material, and Arthur Schomburg telling me, go study the history of your masters. Study the people who took you out of history. Then you'll understand your history. I started on an old chestnut, recently mentioned, H.G. Wells' Outline of History. It is still worth reading. It is a good basic outline. His basic facts are in order. When he tells you about the Crusades, he's not off one iota. But his interpretation is basically Eurocentric to the point of being a prejudiced document. Now, I was reading these kinds of books. I was reading Spingarn's Decline of the West when I was 18 years old. So I began to read European masterpieces, and I began to read European curiosity about Africa. Gerald Massey's 6-volume, Egypt, Light of the World, 2 volumes. Natural Genesis, 2 volumes. Book of the Beginning, 2 volumes. And I began to read Gerald Massey's attitude on religion and his idea that nearly European concepts of religion were stolen from outside of Europe. He was not a historian. He was not an Egyptologist. He was an agnostic, fighting the arrogance of the European of that day. See, the History Club led me to not only reading masterpieces by white radical writers who set the black radical writers in motion. A whole lot of claims blacks did not make until they saw the documents in works written by Europeans. And these works written by Europeans, what black had the time and the money to sit down and do a 6-volume work?
Well, Dr. Clark, I would like you to hold it right there. Yes, thank you. Hold it right there.
But what Professor Lefkowitz accused me of, not paying attention to historical chronology, and if she read any of my texts, any of my numerous guides and curriculars and lecture notes, you know that I'm a specialist on chronology. I know that 1 comes first and 2 comes second. But what I was trying to get across is that in the 8th century to the 12th century, so the intellectual emergence of Europe, at a time Egypt was in its 23rd dynasty and dying after nearly 10,000 years of some forms of organized society, Europe intellectually was just being born. And I further maintain that Europe in general had nothing to do with the creation of Rome and Greece, and yet the challenge of Rome and Greece created Europe, because they were scattered tribes, and the challenge of Rome and Greece brought them together, and they became a people strong enough to create a state. If anybody got any information to the contrary, state the information to the contrary. I maintain that there was no Europe. You're giving Europe credit for things that happened before the first European war. Shue lived in a house that had a window. And I'm saying that you have not read, not just Massey, Joe Massey, his European disciple, Churchward, Signs and Symbols of Primordial Man, the Origins of Religions, and his extensive work on Freemasonry. You've not read the American disciple of Massey, Alvin Boyd Kuhn, is Who is This King of Glory, one of the best written books on the Christ story, when he proves that the basis of European spirituality was taken directly from Africa.
Professor Rogers, would you like to follow on your question?
I mean,
no one is actually maintaining that literary Greek culture pre-existed any number of Near Eastern cultures. Again, I find it a bit curious.
I don't accept Egypt as Near East. I accept Egypt as physically a part of Africa, created by the Africans from the South.
Even if I concede or admit or agree with you that Egypt is part of Africa, what I'm about to say
There will be order. Thank you. There will be order. Thank you very much.
Do I detect some disagreement?
Yeah.
My point was going to be that the most recent scholarship about the genesis of those two oral epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, points, in fact, in another direction to influence, and that is, in fact, the Hittite Empire, whose documents we can read very easily, and there may well be independent confirmation of the historicity of some form of a Trojan War in those documents. And so what I'm really asking is, why is it that we're just really looking in one direction when we're talking about the origins of Greek civilization?
Professor Clark?
When Alexander entered Egypt, he wrote home to his mother and said that he at last reached the land where the Greek gods began, Apollo and Zeus. And he wanted to consult one of the great African teachers of oracles. And the oracle asked, how old is this man? He said, 32. They said, in 20 years, maybe he'll be wise enough to ask me a question that I care to answer.
Professor Clark, would you like to ask Professor Rogers a question? All right, we are waiting. Professor Clark?
Yes.
It is your turn to ask Professor Rogers a question.
My main concern is that they seem to have equated the civilizations of the Tigris and the Euphrates with the civilization of the Nile. What proof do you have that the civilization of the Tigris and the Euphrates predated the civilization of the Nile?
I don't think that I said that, and I don't think that anyone maintains that. I think the Hittite Empire obviously comes at a much later period.
I know very clear when the Hittite Empire came, I know what damage they did, because I maintain that every people who came into Africa, Greeks, everything from modern day English, everybody that came into Africa did Africa more harm than good. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And that Africa owes nothing to outsiders in regard to development, because all of them declared war on African culture, war on African civilization, war on African ways of life. They began to bastardize Africa and confuse and create a kind of historical schizophrenia that the Africans had even got rid of to this very day. And they created whole words that did not previously exist, like Middle East. Middle from what?
In round two, we will continue. Professor Clark, you will ask the first question in round two of Professor Mary Lefkowitz.
Well, Professor Lefkowitz, at your own admission, you encountered J.A. Rogers 4 or 5 years ago. J.A. Rogers didn't say he was a historian. He was a searcher trying to find the role of the African personality in world history. He worked over 50 years of his life, gave his service, died broke. What gives you the audacity to think that you can dismiss Rogers out of hand, and what gave you the maturity to think that you can judge a writer like Sheikh Anta Diop, the finest historical writer we have produced in the 20th century?
Sir, deal with that.
I try to ask questions of all the material I read. I try to answer those questions on the basis of the evidence, the historical evidence. It all, in my view, comes down to that. And I do not wish to criticize any individual at all. I am dealing only with written work. The people who write that, I do not always know, and I have no individual or personal criticism of them. This is the way scholars, I'm sure, as you know, proceed, and that is simply what I did in my book. I will leave it to everyone who reads the book to judge what I did.
All right,
Professor Clark?
I think you have emphasized too much the word black, and we made the same mistake. Black tells you how you look, but it don't tell you who you are. The proper name of a people must always relate to land, history, and culture. I did not say Cleopatra was black. I quoted someone else who inferred that. My defense of Cleopatra is not on her blackness, but on no matter whatever she was. She was born in Africa. Her manipulation of Mark Antony and Caesar kept the worst aspect of Roman rule from the backs of Africa. I defend her as an African nationalist. And that's a good defense. And no matter what she did with her wares in and out of bed, there's a whole lot of people got less for it.
Professor Lefkowitz, you may ask a question of Professor Clark.
Professor Clark, do you think that we should always judge history in terms of race?
Look, there was no such thing as race in the psyche of the world until the Europeans put it into the psyche of the world. The Africans knew nothing about race and didn't think they belonged to anything called a race. And when the Africans saw the Europeans, because they have a traditional hospitality to strangers, they didn't fight them, they didn't kill, they were curious about them. And with the African explorers, especially Mungo Park, went into Africa, nobody hurt him, nobody shot at him, nobody shot any arrows at him. The Europeans went in peacefully, but the Africans heard that Mungo Park was a pork eater. Most people don't know it, but Africans were not great pork eaters, and they're not great pork eaters today. Pork was a meat you ate in certain ceremonies, certain times a year. But we were not great pork eaters before we came to the United States, or were forced to the United States. But in the United States, we had to eat the part of the pigs that white folks threw away, so we made delicacies out of it and survived. I had this argument with Malcolm X. I said, if it wasn't for the black woman making delicacies out of pig feet, pig heels, guts, chitlins, you and I wouldn't be here arguing the point. I'm afraid that you're not only a delinquent in African history, you're delinquent in African folklore. So much of our history is tied up with our folklore, but Europe has introduced words that didn't exist in anyone's vocabulary before. No one ever thought of anybody being inferior or superior. Intelligent people don't even devote. A human being can't fall into that category. And nobody had the extensive problem the Europeans had with women, because in the period of feudalism in Europe that lasted over 1,000 years, the white woman in Europe was a vassal. But the African woman has never been a vassal in that sense. If you read Sheikh Anta Diop's The Cultural Unity of Black Africa, dealing with the history of the matriarch, he got all evidence right there that we were the first people to support a woman as head of state. We were the first people to support women as riding ahead of her army. We were the first people to make women a god.
I'd like to ask Dr. Bernal to ask of Dr. Rogers a question.
I agree. I haven't read Black Athena Revisited. I haven't yet received my copy. But I do know who the contributors are, and I have read the reviews they wrote, and these reviews, I'm told, are very similar to the ones that originally appeared. So the title Revisited is slightly misleading, because these were immediate responses in the heat of polemic. Now, I have no doubt that the conclusions he summarized are the conclusions found in the book, but I'm not sure whether they're the result of an impartial selection, because having read most of the reviews, not all the reviews of my work, I find a pretty systematic selection for Black Athena Revisited from the hostile ones, and other ones which were more balanced or more friendly to me have been in fact, completely systematically not requested, or if requested, refused. And these include the three experts on Egyptian-Greek relations, not Egyptologists, not Hellenists, but specialists in the interrelations between the two cultures. And these three scholars' works were, in fact, excluded, and it seems, I wonder, if there's any other explanation for their exclusion than the fact that they would have appeared too friendly, or to have taken my work too seriously, and serious is a word repeated in these reviews. Thank you.
I'm afraid I have some rather bad news for you, Professor Bernal. Professor Lefkowitz and I actually didn't read just some of the reviews of your work. We read them all. We collected them all. There's 50 pages of bibliography at the back of our book with asterisks next to the current outstanding reviews of your work from 1987 until just a few months ago. As for the selection process of the essays that went into it, I have to say to you that we, in fact, do believe that we have given a representative sample and here's where the really bad news is, we actually excluded the ones that attacked you personally or attacked your competence for this field. As far as the three experts on Greek-Egyptian relations are concerned, two of them that you're referring to must be Eric Klein and Stanley Burstein. Eric Klein has written several articles about those relations. We, in fact, did ask him if he wanted to contribute, but he couldn't meet our deadline. When he eventually did, I'm afraid to tell you that his essay did not actually agree completely with your conclusions, but the reason why it wasn't in the collection was that it came in too late. As far as Professor Burstein is concerned, I'm afraid that his essay was much more critical than you seem to believe. So that really is the explanation, I think, for those omissions. I might say that as far as our editorial posture was concerned, we realized that these are sensitive, difficult issues. And we fully expected that we would be in this room here tonight. We didn't know the date, but we knew we'd be here. And so what we did, what we tried to do, was we tried to have what we call full disclosure. It's the reason why the book turned out to be not just another 150-page book with some essays sort of thrown together, but a book which attempts to give summaries of comprehensive accounts of the questions that Bernal raises. And we give Bernal full credit for raising those questions. I think that Professor Clark and others are quite correct. Professor Bernal is not the first person to raise those questions, but in fact, he raised them in a compelling and interesting way, and we feel that we are giving him and those of you who are interested in these problems, as we are, complete respect, both by answering them in full and by being here tonight to defend our views.
I want to just, if I might...
Can I come back?
Yes, please do. I'm sorry.
I don't expect any scholar to agree with me entirely, and what I found with the reviews he said is that they did not agree with all I said, but they took what I said seriously, and they did agree with some significant things. I don't want total praise, and I'm sure they're right that the predominant reaction from the disciplines which I am challenging is hostile. I don't question that for the moment. But the selection does include, I'm told, personal attacks on me as being a baby and various other things. So I don't think they've been quite so scrupulous as far as that is concerned. I'm also intrigued because one person who had attended the meeting, the party given for the contributors to the book, which of course I was told nothing about, described it as a lynch mob. Another mutual friend of Mary's and mine refers to it regularly as the shit on Bernal book. And so I think there are very different perceptions of this book.
Yes, Professor.
Is that a title that you come up with on the spot, or is it something you've been thinking about, Professor?
No, it's a title that a mutual friend of Mary's and mine uses regularly. He's a colleague at Cornell. It's not, I wouldn't have thought that up.
I think that if you look carefully, and I'm sorry that you haven't had an opportunity to work through the book carefully yet, I think when you do, you will see that there are not very many ad hominem attacks in it, although I find your defensiveness about that somewhat curious, since in Black Athena, volumes 1 and 2, part of your methodology has involved actually contextualizing people and talking about their family relations, their own personal backgrounds. And so I'm a little bit puzzled by that kind of response.
I have no objection to people attacking me personally. What I would like to see is a all-round collection, and I think that as I live by the sword of the sociology of knowledge, I must be prepared to die by it. And I think that people will see in 20 years where I'm coming from or what my personal problems or axes were. But, and I think that's part of the story of the book, but I think there's also the substance of the book. And I would have hoped to have found more, a wider scan, and we've had many collected volumes on this. I mean, don't think this is the first response to my work. There have been 4 journals now have had selections of articles on my responses and their responses to my responses, and there has been real dialogue. This was a book which I was not told about till long after it had begun, and when I was told about it and asked if I could see the pieces to write a response, I was told there was to be no response, and furthermore that the responses that I had published to the articles criticizing me were not to be included. This does not seem to me opening the debate, it seems to me stamping out heresy.
Excuse me. May I respond to that? May I respond to that briefly?
We will have a free-for-all in a minute.
Okay.
But I wanted to follow up on a phrase that you said, and I didn't want to leave it unaddressed, the issue of full disclosure. And it is to that I'd like to ask the question of Professor Lefkowitz. Are you comfortable with the fact, you obviously were comfortable with the fact that your book, Not Out of Africa, subtitled How Afrocentrism Became an Excuse to Teach Myth as History, was underwritten by several foundations that have reportedly rightist leanings. I wondered whether this was a reflection of your own personal or ideological view, or whether you were just so cash-strapped that you took money from anywhere.
No one tells me what to think, and no one tells me what to say except me, and the main financing of this book was out of my own pocket.
But surely you can appreciate the color of accepting funds from foundations that do not enjoy wide acclaim and receptivity. And I thought that maybe there was some concern on your part, in as much as you were interested in integrity, scholastic integrity and all, that you might have foregone the grants in the interest of academic and scholarly integrity.
If they had asked of me to do anything, I would not have accepted these grants. They did not do that. Therefore, the grants did not go to me, they went to Wellesley College, which had no objection to taking the money.
But still the question remains. You have a duty, do you not, inasmuch as you are preparing work, the aim of which is to overturn the revisionism, you say, that is going on in black studies, particularly in African studies, this whole battle that you have been dealing with in terms of Afrocentricity. Do you not, regardless of where Wellesley chose to accept money from, do you not, as a scholar, have an obligation to discern where this money is coming from, to see whether the source is compatible with your own views as a scholar?
I did not see anything in the conditions of the grant that inhibited what I did and what I meant to do or say or think. I believe that I acted with perfect integrity. Now, you may disagree with that, and you may disagree with the aims of those foundations and other foundations, and that is what we do in a free country. Until they are outlawed, I don't see what else can be done.
Well, let me ask you the question perhaps more directly. Had there been, say, a foundation to wipe out scholarship of any sort, if such a foundation were to have given money to Wellesley College, would you have found it equally acceptable to take money from such a foundation to further your work?
I don't know what foundation you're talking about. This seems to be a
It was a
totally
hypothetical
unnecessary-
question.
It's totally hypothetical. I don't know what you're trying to force me to say or to compel me into what
understand.
corner you're
I'm
tending
not,
to put me.
I'm
If
not
you want
forcing,
to go ahead and attack me, do.
I'm not
That's
forcing
fine.
you
You're,
to say anything,
be my
Professor
guest.
Lefkowitz. I'm just trying to elicit a cogent response from you.
Well, you be the judge of my response.
All right. Okay, in this last round, before we get to questions, and we will get to questions, but let me warn you, you ought to have questions that are questions, not lectures, and that are straight to the point. In this round, it will be a free-for-all in which all of the discussants are permitted to ask questions of each other and to chime in responses whether they are asked the question directly or not.
Will we have time to sum up afterwards?
Yes, you certainly will.
You treat. I think we should. All right. I just wanted Professor Lefkowitz to know some basic information about the concept of Afrocentricity. There's a lot of people who believe in the African awakening and discovering of their history and their culture who do not accept the word Afrocentricity because it's a compromise with the word African. It's either African centricity or it's nothing. That's right. And if she attacks Afrocentricity as the teacher of myth, have she attacked the nonsense about Columbus discovering America? Because he discovered absolutely nothing, and he committed an act of genocide. He set in motion an act of genocide 10 times worse than the act of genocide in Europe called the Holocaust, as though that was the only Holocaust in the world. That event in Europe was wrong. And even if only 6 people were killed, it was wrong. But it was a matter started in Europe by Europeans that should have been solved in Europe by Europeans.
I'm sure that you're aware, as we are, that there is a spectrum of Afro and African-centric views. I'm a little bit curious what you think then of the work of Asante, who, as far as I know, does call himself an Afrocentrist. Are you saying that Professor Asante's work actually is flawed conceptually?
I'm saying that all work under the guise of Afrocentrist is not perfect, but it is an earnest effort to restore Africa to a proper commentary in human history. I think Professor Asante's work is written too fast, and there's some things he hadn't checked out as well as he need to, and I think too many times Afrocentricity becomes a personality cult, but that don't mean that I'm against African people discovering their history, their literature, their place in the political science of the world. That don't mean that I have not played a role in encouraging people to write about Africans in all the societies of the world. See, your talk keeps telling me what you have not read. You could not have been asking these questions about Afrocentricity if you have not read Anacalypsis, 2 volumes dealing with the massive explosion of African people throughout the whole world. You could not possibly have read with any degree of understanding the 3 volumes, Africans in early Asia, Africans in early Europe, Africans in early America. We're not talking about no hearsay. We're talking about documents. Professor Joseph Harris's book dealing with the global dimensions of the African diaspora. I don't know, I mean, you keep telling me, you keep confessing your ignorance with your questions. You have not read, I'm telling you, before Afrocentricity, radical Europeans had pioneered in this work. Now, I haven't even mentioned the radical black writers that you probably have not read. Now, if you read Chancellor Williams' chapter 2 in the book, Destruction of Black Civilization, read that chapter 2 called Egypt, Ethiopia's oldest daughter. And it deals with the southern African origins of Egypt. If you read a book called Nubia, Corridor to Africa, once more you got it. Also you got the early Arab slave trade. I keep saying nobody came into Africa to do African people any good. After the Romans had disgraced themselves trying to be early Christians, the Africans thought that by accepting Islam, they could get the Romans off of their back. They were right. They did get the Romans off their back. But the Arabs replaced the Romans on their back, and the Arabs are still on their back.
Speaking of book reading, I'm a little bit...
Welcome back to the channel. I hope you've seen by yourself, you've learned by yourself, and you've known how things really happened. And really, it has opened my eye. It has given me a perspective. And one of the most important things that I would like to say is that Africa, black people in general, we have really played important part in the world civilization, let alone the African civilization, but the world civilization. How we've changed things, how we have, generally done our things as people, has made it clearly to see things in a different way. And these did not did not get to see the sun, because the person who wrote history wrote his story rather than writing what was reality. And there were core issues of contention while I was trying to watch this debate, So generally, there are a couple of things that I'm yet to say which were the core issues of the contention that led to rise of, the Afrocentrism perspective and the Eurocentrism perspective of the two scholars, right? Now, the African origins of ancient Egypt. This was Dr. Clark's perspective. Dr. Clark and many Afrocentric scholars argued that ancient Egypt was a black African civilization, that it contributed significantly to the development of Western civilization, particularly Greece. Clark emphasizes that Egypt's location in Africa and its cultural genetic ties to sub-Saharan Africa meant that it should be regarded as part of the broader African heritage. Right now, on the other hand, listen to what Lefkowitz said. She argued that there was little to no evidence to support the claim that the ancient Egypt were black Africans in the modern sense. She asserted that the civilization of ancient Egypt was distinct and not racially connected to the sub-Saharan African population. This disagreement on the racial identity of the ancient Egypt was a major point of contention. Understand, the disagreement of the racial identity of the ancient Egypt was the point of contention. So, you tell me, where is Egypt? Who are Egyptians? Are Egyptians Africans or Egyptians Europeans? You like to ask that question because that was the bone of contention. Egypt is in Africa. The early ancient people who are Egyptians, they are Africans. They were black. The true images that are being showed shows or indicates that they were black. So for me, now this is my take. For me, I see Egypt as a black place. I don't see Egypt as a European place. So what Mary Lefkowitz was trying to say, she was trying to say that, Egypt, there is no evidence indicating that Egypt was in Africa. What in particular, like even today when I'm talking to you, Egypt is in Africa, right? So maybe, I don't know, maybe you tell me, because that's what I can see for myself. That's what I can see on my side. And that what Dr. Henry Clark John was trying to say. So another thing that, while I was trying to watch the video, I also see another major issue was the influence of Egypt on ancient Greece. Afrocentric scholars like Dr. Clark posited that Greek philosophy and science were heavily influenced by the Egyptian knowledge, and that many famous Greek thinkers such as Pythagoras, Plato, Socrates studied in Egypt and borrowed extensively from its wisdom. Clark supported the idea that much of what is credited to Greece in terms of philosophy, science, and mathematics had African/Egyptian origin, and this is truth. The art of mathematics, when we had people from the Sumerians, Egyptians, and all these people, the art of studying maths, looking at the calendars, all it started from Egypt, because they were during the Agrarian Revolution, they were trying to look at the writing forms, the cuneiform and all things, the early civilization that came definitely from Egypt, which is part of Africa, and was part of Africa. There hasn't been nothing, or there hasn't been any continental drift that took took Egypt from Africa and put it from another place. So you might want to argue in a different way, but just the way I see it, that's the way I understand it. So listen to what Lefkowitz said. Oh, definitely, she rejected it, arguing that while the Greeks were aware of Egyptian culture and have admired certain aspects of it, there was no significant evidence that Greek philosophy or science was directly borrowed from Egypt. She believed that the Greek civilization developed independently and that claims of Egypt's intellectual dominance over Greece were overstated or unsubstantiated. Yes, that one. So, unsubstantiated. So, Lefkowitz's point of argument was like she was trying to say that at no point there is no direct or there is no link of evidence that really shows that Greek, Rome borrowed anything from Egypt. However, she recognizes that it was admirable, the discoveries of Egypt, the civilization, and definitely everything which was mind-blowing that came from Egypt, which is and was in Africa. Now, my third point that I'm going to be looking at is historical revisionism. A broader issue in the debate was the question of historical revisionism. Lefkowitz accused Afrocentric scholars of promoting a revisionist history that was not grounded in solid evidence. She argued that some Afrocentric claims were motivated more by the desire for cultural pride and identity than a careful reading of historical facts. And clearly you could see that was her main everything that she was saying, that there is no evidence linked to A, there is no direct evidence linked to B, there is no direct evidence linked to C. That was what she majorly banked on heavily. That was what she said most of the time, right? So we have a problem. Some black scholars, like the people that we listen to, have the problem of historical revisionism. Using it to the advantage to boost their cultural pride or something. Now listen to what Clark said. So, Dr. Clark, on the other hand, argued that traditional Eurocentric history had long marginalized and distorted contribution of Africa to world civilization, and that Afrocentric scholarship was an effort to correct this historical omission and distortion. Clark saw this as part of larger struggle of the black people to reclaim their history, culture, and identity in a world where they had been systematically dehumanized and erased. And we know this is true, right? Because I could not agree more with what he said in regards to this. So another thing that I don't like to say is representation of Africa in history. For the longest time, the representation of African in history have been poor. Because a lot of things that Africa did was distorted, was really, really distorted. And probably the day will come when things will get into light. That's why black scholars, Afrocentric, are really, really fighting to ensure that the truth is out there, and not other than Dr. John Henry Clark, who did this way, I don't know when, it's 8 years ago, not 8 years, but it was 1996. I wasn't even born, right? But remember, today we are seeing other Afrocentric scholars who are trying to push for the truth, where in the face of the Westerners, they'll term it as historical revisionism, where we use things that are not evidence-based to, make us feel good. So, representation of Africa in history. Now, Dr. Clark's position was that the mainstream Western scholarship had for centuries downplayed or ignored the contributions of African to human history, particularly in the fields of science, art, and philosophy. He saw this as part of larger pattern of systemic racism that sought to deny African people through their rightful place in the world history. Now, Lefkowitz, on the other hand, insisted that her critique was not about denying the value of African culture, but about to ensure historical claims were based on factual evidence. She was concerned that Afrocentric teachings, as she perceived them, were promoting ideas that were unsupported by historical and archaeological data. Now, what's the significance of this debate? The debate between Dr. Clark and Mary Lefkowitz symbolized the broader cultural and intellectual clash between Afrocentric and Eurocentric perspectives on the world history. For Afrocentrists, it was part of the larger effort to decolonize history and to challenge the long-standing erasure of African contributions to civilization. For Lefkowitz and her supporters, it was a defense of academic rigor and historical accuracy against what they saw as politicized and ideologically driven distortion of history. So, for me, I think that the debate remains important discussion around race, history, and education, particularly in the context of how the marginalized group try to seek and reclaim and reassert their historical identities in the face of dominant cultural narratives. It's time to remove his story to put the true history, which should be there. As usual, these are presented in Tech Stories, and if you're watching this video for the first time, I'll ask you to subscribe to the channel, to join the membership, and really get to see what I can offer you. Peace, love, and harmony. Salute.